The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
To try to describe God, this massive cosmic reality, what else are we going to use but poetry? And so that's why I think, to read the Gospels through the lens of poetry is to say that we need a language that is not just trying to state fact, but that is opening space for questions, that is opening space for mystery, that is okay with mystery. Because to me, poetry is invitational, right? It's welcoming the reader into a deeper conversation.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Drew Jackson is a poet and the founding pastor of Hope East Village in New York City. His new collection of poems is Touch the Earth, Poems Along the Way. These poems are hospitable and angry. They express gratitude while making big demands. They offer more questions than answers. I commend these poems to you. Drew Jackson, I'm so glad to have you on the Habit Podcast to talk about your pretty new collection, Touch the Earth, Poems on the Way.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's so good to be here.
I just ate these poems up. I just think there's so much good going on in here. So I'm really eager to talk about them.
Thank you.
So each poem is it fair to say a response to a verse or a passage from the Gospel of Luke? How do you describe the relationship between these poems and the Gospel of Luke?
Yeah, I would say that they're in conversation with them.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a bit of response there, but it's more of I'm talking with the text a little bit,
Okay.
Not necessarily trying to write a commentary on an individual verse or a passage of scripture, but yeah, just trying to converse with it, to see where the text wants to lead me in terms of my own imagination, what poems want to rise out of these texts as they're interacting with the stuff in my own soul and my own life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you going through the Gospel of Luke verse by verse and entering into conversation? I mean, what was the process like by which you produce? I mean, because these poems are arranged in such a way that it goes from I guess chapter 9 of Luke to the end of Luke, just in verse by verse.
Yeah. So this is the second book. The first book that I wrote, God Speaks Through Wombs, is in conversation with the first 8 chapters of Luke's gospel.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, the idea for this whole project came from, I think, a couple different places for me. The first was, I started this at the beginning of the pandemic, the beginning of lockdown, and I just needed some sort of practice that was going to, anchor me in the midst of it, being in New York City, right at the, sort of the epicenter here at the beginning of things, and in my apartment with my family, and just navigating everything that was going on in our world and in my own sort of interior landscape. Poetry found me in a new way in that time, and as, in particular with the the conversations that were happening around the racial violence that was taking place in the nation with, the killings of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And, I just felt like I needed some conversation partners in the midst of quarantine. And I found myself in the Gospel of Luke. And I think in particular Luke, because Luke has already this, the way that Luke is telling the narrative of the gospel is Luke is very intentional about centering the voices of marginalized communities in his telling. So whether that's women or the poor, right? There's this sense of these people who know what it feels like to sort of live on the underside of empire, right? And to, speak out from that place. So I was interested in just talking with the characters in the text, talking with the Jesus who finds himself there. And also there's this other aspect of it where I was also sitting in the Psalms at the time. And there's a tradition that the ancient rabbis used to say that the 5 books of the Psalter are not commentaries on, but in conversation with the 5 books of Torah. Right. Okay. And so each book, sort of corresponds in with each section of the Psalms in a certain way. And so I was in book 2 of the Psalms and just, the beginning of that, like right in Psalm 40, right, where you hear the psalmist as a deer pants for flowing streams, so my soul thirsts for you, and all those sorts of things. And, you can read those as like an individual sort of giving voice to their longing for God. But what happens when you read that against the backdrop of, say, the book of Exodus, where you sort of hear something different? You hear a community that's longing for something, like in the desert, in this dry and weary land, all these sorts of things. And so I said to myself, what would it feel like and sound like if the Gospels gave rise to poetry today? Right. And so then it was just sort of, my imagination just went from there. And these 2 books, really, which for me are one project, came out of that place.
Yeah. Wow. So sometimes that's you picking up on a phrase, like, the shaking the dust off, and writing a poem about that, or a story like the feeding of the 5,000, which feels like it makes more than one appearance.
Yeah.
Am I right about that, or am I?
Yeah,
literally make more than one appearance, or
well,
there's a lot of fish fries in this book. Let's put it that way.
No, there's the first one, right? There's the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 9, and then the fish fry poem that I write at the end is Jesus showing up on the shore after the resurrection and eating fish with the disciples, right? So there's that bookend of fish. Yeah.
But I love the way. I mean, even something like the fish fry, that is, what am I even trying to say here? I mean, the way that you bring the notion of the feeding of the 5,000, or Jesus eating the fish at the end of the Gospels, both of which seem a little bit. I mean, I remember seeing pictures of that from my children's Bible a long, long time ago. But to frame that as, hey, this is the same, this is very similar to a fish fry that you grew up with, that I grew up with, and I haven't been to a fish fry in a long time. But I have many happy memories of fish fries, and I love all the fried fish in this book.
Yeah. There's something about bringing the stuff of the text into conversation with real life, with my life. And that looks like a cookout in the backyard. That looks like a fish fry, that looks like, you know, the stuff of my childhood. But also being able to say, okay, when I look at it again with new eyes, I can see that even in those places in my grandmama's house or with my mom, there's something of the kingdom of God that's showing up in that place. And I want to give voice to that. I want to write that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to name that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, since we're on the subject of the feeding the 5,000 and the fish fries, I love the way, when you say, don't go to the fish fry without some Tupperware, because there's going to be leftovers.
Yeah.
And the way that abundance from your life and your experience speaks to, that the fact that there's an economy at work in the feeding of the 5,000 that denies the economy of scarcity and supply and demand and those kind of things, that says there's something truer than the law of supply and demand and the laws of scarcity. And I love the reminder in that one poem that, you know what, even in this world, there are communities where that kind of abundance really does oppose the economies of scarcity. Even where it seems like you wouldn't expect to look.
Absolutely. Those poems, they're on one hand, they are poems about economics, right? They're, the economy of, like you talked about, like you named, scarcity versus this economy of abundance, and how, scarcity is this idea that there is not enough to go around. And that's just a narrative that we have bought into, that we just say is, and we never question it. Is that really true? Or is there something deeper that's real? And I think, what Jesus is given, naming and demonstrating in the feeding of the 5,000 and so many other places, is that no, the reality is abundance. And there's something about blessing and breaking. That's one of the lines, right? Blessing and breaking what little we have is the last line in one of my poems, is that, like, there's something about that gives way to abundance when we as human community bless and break what we have, and we open our hands and we share instead of hoard. There's abundance in that, right? And so, I was just thinking about those things and saying, man, that showed up at grandmom's house. I remember that. Yeah.
The last two lines of that leftovers poem: take as much as you want, child. There's plenty to go around. That's just a statement of the abundance of the kingdom of God. All right. I mean, that line that we hear, that you hear from your grandmother, is just a restatement of that Tupperware. In Jesus' miracle, it was 12 baskets. And in your poem, it's Tupperware, and a grandmother saying, there's plenty to go around. I love it. So good. Patrick Otuma wrote the foreword to this book. And he remarks that you have at least 3 areas of deep study that he had, and I'm sure there are more than 3, but the Gospels, poetry, and community. And that you read the Gospels through the lens of poetry and community. What does that mean to say that? Like, how does that work itself out? If it's true, that you didn't say that Patrick Otuma said it, but assuming that's correct. What does that mean? Did you see the gospel through the lens of poetry and community?
Yeah, man. First, I love Padraig. He's a good friend, and it was a gift to have him offer this forward. And but when he says that, it really struck me the first time I read that from him, and I was like, I think that is true. I think that's true. I read something the other day. I think it was a tweet from Diana Butler Bass, and she said in her tweet, she said, I think that the only way to do theology is poetry. She said, I'm increasingly convinced that that's true. And, I think that that's something that over the years, and as I've sat with the text of scripture, but also as I've gone deeper and deeper into poetry, is something that resonates with my soul. And part of it is that I see so much poetry throughout scripture. When I'm reading the Gospels and I'm reading about, I'm reading the parables of Jesus, and I'm seeing all of these poetic devices that Jesus is using, the, simile and metaphor. And you can only, use poetry to sort of reach at something like the kingdom of God, to try and put it into words. Right. I mean, even just the task of theology itself, right. To try to describe, talk about, grasp at God, this massive cosmic reality, right? What else are we going to use but poetry, right? and so that's why I think, to read the Gospels through the lens of poetry is to say, one, right, that we need a language that is not just trying to state fact, but that is opening space for questions, that is opening space for mystery, that is okay with mystery, and saying, I don't necessarily know, but I imagine it could be this way, maybe. And it's because to me, poetry is invitational, right? It's welcoming the reader into a deeper conversation that is not just to say, hey, here's what I think is an answer to this, whatever, but it's to say, no, these are deep waters here, and there are layers here, and there's mystery here. Take a step in at a time. Take a step in at a time. And that's what the Gospels do. And that's what Jesus is always doing, even as he invites his disciples on this journey of follow me. I mean, that's just this poetic journey into the mystery of God. And so for me, that is, I do read the Gospels through that lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that language of inviting the reader in, creating a space for the reader to come in. And it makes me think about that your poem, "The Last Frontier," where you describe going to the Jacob Riis houses in New York City, and this place that is very, very run down. The world is kind of beaten up, and your conversation with two women there, which I trust is a true story that you.
It is a true story.
Yeah, I didn't think you dreamed that up.
It is.
And these women, you said, I don't know why I'm reading your poems to you. I need to get you to read them to me, but we'll do that in a minute.
Okay.
Walking by, I say hello, and of course they invite me to sit. Hospitality is a characteristic of heaven. Sensing that I'm new, they begin to tell me all. And then I love those last four lines. We've been pushed to the edge here. We call this the last frontier. Welcome to the neighborhood. We're glad you're here. Mm-hmm. And that idea of these people who have been pushed to the margins, pushed to the edges, and still saying, this is our space. Welcome to it. That feels really important to the work of what poets do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's not a question, but maybe you have something to say about it.
No, I just a affirmation and agreement with that. And I guess I've never thought about it in those terms, but when you say that, I'm like, I think that is the work of poetry and the work of poets in the world. And often, I mean, poets, even when we talk about, poetry as a genre of writing, poetry is not typically, poets are not mainstream, right? Poets kind of float around the edges of things. Yeah. So I like that poets sort of had that vocation, if you will, of hospitality, invitation into something. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, so good. This collection of poems, I feel the hospitality, right? You spent a lot. There are lots of poems about people sitting down and eating together. Mm-hmm. There are poems about inviting people in. And yet at the same time, I mean, you say some hard things, right? I mean, there's a prophetic voice at work here. That is, so on the one hand, you are taking a posture of receptivity, of abundance, of receiving and being grateful.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other hand, you are making demands
Mm-hmm.
of people who withhold.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how you, speaking as a white person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who I read your poems, I felt very welcomed,
Mm-hmm.
and also felt rebuked in ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you, I don't know, that there's some real tension here that I'm going to need help from you in getting this language right. Because, I think of, open-handedness, gratitude, receptivity as being a pretty different thing from demanding.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow you do both in ways that work. So can we talk about that?
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that. I kind of want to go back to those two women that, in the Last Frontier poem, because I think, and even just the way that you talked about what poetry does in terms of the hospitality and the welcome. But, you sit down when I sat down with those two women, right, they welcomed me to the neighborhood, and they were gracious, and they were, it was such a beautiful and hospitable conversation. And with that was also the truth telling of the conversation of how hard it has been in the neighborhood, of the realities of the place, of, yes, we have been pushed to the edges here. We call this the last frontier, and all the realities behind why that is, right? As a newcomer to the neighborhood, that's not easy to hear, right? Because that's something that's like, okay, am I just a part of the pushing to the edge, right? Am I a part of that? So we had, those are real conversations around things like gentrification and stuff like that, right? Which here in New York is such a big conversation, and it's a charged conversation, and one that, folks who are moving into the city sort of want to stay away from because they don't want to feel indicted by those things. But at the same time, it's, I think, part of sitting down at someone's table, right, and eating their food is having that conversation. But when you've crossed that bridge into, okay, we are there's some friendship here. We can talk honestly, right? Can I talk truthfully with you? Here are some things that we need to talk about, right? That exist, that are real. And I think that's the posture of these poems, is both the hospitality is there, and extending that welcome, and with that, there's some hard conversations that need to be had. And I think that's what the Gospels do, right? That's what you see in a person like Jesus, who sits down at tables and loves to do that. Will sit and have a meal with the religious leaders, and then there's rebuke at the same time. How do those two things fit together? And so I think that's what the tension that I'm sitting with in these poems, which I think is what poetry does often.
Well, the word I didn't use, because for some reason it didn't occur to me. Maybe this may be relevant to the fact that this word didn't occur to me, but I could have used the word anger, right? You're hospitable and angry at the same time. That's a trick.
Yeah, I think what it is, what I wanted to do in this book with these poems was really be honest about the journey toward what it means to be fully human. What it means to wrestle and grapple with our full humanity. The quote at the beginning of the book is a quote from Saint Irenaeus, where Irenaeus says, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive." Right. And so what does it mean to be fully alive human beings? Well, part of that means that we have to grapple with the full range of human emotion. Right. So that is the joy, that is the cookout in the backyard and all of that. And there's the sorrow and the grief and the anger and all of those things are real. Right. So what does it mean to kind of get in the dirt of all of that? And I think that's the journey. That's what it means to be on the way, right? It is to grapple with all those things.
Yeah. I've mentioned gratitude,
Mm-hmm.
and you articulate a somewhat complicated relationship to gratitude
Mm-hmm.
in these poems. And it's gratitude is a theme that I end up talking about a lot with people, and I think it's such an important creative force, right? To acknowledge the gifts that we've been given, the abundance that's been offered to us, and to be grateful for it. But you also point out that gratitude can cover up things that need to be exposed.
Mm-hmm.
You got that poem about Thanksgiving dinner, Thanksgiving etiquette, I think is what it's called.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Where, in this day of thanks, sometimes in the day of thanks, we gloss over injustices.
Yeah.
Another way to frame it is that it's easy from somebody on my side of things to mistake white privilege for God's blessing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or to equate them in ways that are not useful for anybody.
Yeah.
I'm going to, let's talk about gratitude a minute. That I've got a particular line from one of your poems that I want to ask you about. But yeah, the tell me about gratitude and your complicated. Is that fair to say you have a complicated relationship to gratitude?
Well, I think it's fair to say that what I want to do in these poems is complicate our engagement with gratitude. Not in the sense that I love gratitude, right? I love it's one of the practices that I have with my wife and I have with our children every night before bed, as we talk about feelings, like what are you feeling, to naming emotions, but also gratitude. What are you thankful for? To name those. And I think part of what I was wanting to do in these poems, you mentioned the Thanksgiving etiquette poem. And that was just really to get at what happens at I was thinking about what happens at so many tables across America on a day like Thanksgiving or any other day, but Thanksgiving in particular, where we want to give thanks for the blessings, right, and just name those things, and hold at arm's length the things that are difficult and hard, and often sometimes the ways that we feel blessed on the other side of what we would name as blessing is pain for someone else or injustice for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think it gets complicated. Whereas to say, especially in a society, in a culture like ours, right? Earlier we talked a lot about economics, and so in the structure, the systemic, the system that we live in, right, that is based on, right, there are the rich and there are the poor, the haves and the have-nots, and there are only the haves because there are have-nots, right? It's like, how do we grapple with something like that as when we find ourselves in positions as those who have, right? Is to say, how do I say, God, thank you for the ways you've blessed us, what you've given, and I think it's okay to name it as that, right? That God, you've blessed us, right? And at the same time, hold that and to say, I realize that we are caught in this web of things that is very complicated. That it's not so simple as we worked hard and they didn't, right? It's not that simple, right? There's pain wrapped up in this. There's injustice wrapped up in this. And so it's just trying to complicate our relationship with something like gratitude, rather than just to say, oh, look at the things that God has given us, God bless, and leave it at that.
Yeah.
But to go beyond that. Yeah.
Okay. So the line I wanted to ask you about, this is a hard thing to swallow.
Yes.
Hatred likes to disguise itself as gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean? This is in a poem called Hatred Goes to Church.
Yes.
When hatred goes to church. What does that line mean, Drew?
Well, that line is from that poem, When Hatred Goes to Church. And well, I wrote that in reflection on the passage in scripture where the religious leaders are standing up in the synagogue and they are praying a prayer, thanking God that they are not, Gentiles, or they're not women, or they're, you know what I mean? And so what's going on in there is underneath of the gratitude, the thank God that we're not them. We're not like them. Yeah. To be blunt, we could name it as hatred, right? Hatred of certain groups of people, the way, mistreatment of certain groups of people, not acknowledging the humanity of certain groups of people. And
defining myself in terms of what I'm not.
Yeah. And thanking God for that. Right. And so I think I was just really sitting in that text as I wrote that poem, and, just wanting us to think about the ways that shows up today. How does that show up today? Even back to that, like, thank God that we're so blessed we have all this, right? I think the flip side of that is thank God that we're not poor. Mm-hmm. Thank God that, you know what I mean? And sure. But for me, I live in New York, and how many of us have to walk by our houseless neighbors on the street to go into church and say, thank God that we had that we're not poor, that we're not them. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to never actually grapple with the humanity of our neighbors who we had to walk by, on the way to church. And so that's just a wrestle, right? A tension there. And just to name it, I know it can feel harsh to even name that as hatred, but if it's not love, what is it? Right? There's indifference, right? There can be indifference, but indifference, you know what I mean? It's like, and that's what I do. I think that's one of the things that poetry does, is it can name some things that sometimes we're scared to name, or afraid, or don't know if this is the right thing. And to say, and I'm not saying you have to name it as hatred, but I'm saying you have to ask the question. Let's ask the question together. Right. Yeah.
So you're a pastor, or are you preaching every Sunday?
So I am in the middle of transitioning out of my pastoral role here at the church in New York. But I planted a church in New York. I'm asking because
I'm wondering if you have courage to say things in poems that are harder to say in a sermon.
So what I'll say is this. I have, I've said hard things in sermons for sure. I think what poetry does is it really has a way of, I think this is interesting, right? When I started writing poems, like, it was a big switch from writing sermons for me. Sermons were so much about feeling like you had to give some sort of resolution, some sort of answer, some sort of thing for people to hold on to. Mm-hmm. Whereas when I write poems, I'm much less concerned about that. I'm like, okay, if I give rise to a question, then that's good. Yeah, I really, if someone reads a poem and goes deeper into thinking about the relationship between like the complication of gratitude, and I'm like, yes, that's good. You're thinking about it, right? And so, I do think poetry allows you to say things different, like some hard things, but it's sort of like in the Emily Dickinson sort of way, tell all the truth but tell it slant. It's like you can say things at an angle sometimes where. Because I think what poetry does is people don't tend to come to poetry armed with a response. Mm-hmm. There's a sort of dropping of your sort of weapons or defenses when you come to a poem. Yeah. I think if you're really honestly going to sit with the poem, that's what you have to do. Yeah. And so, whereas when you're listening to even if you're listening to a sermon, or if you're hearing someone make an argument about something, you're thinking about the retort to that, the response to that. Right. So I think that's why poetry functions a little bit differently. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Poetry confuses often in ways that are helpful, and your job when you're preaching is hopefully not to be confusing people too much.
Make it clear, make it plain. That's what the preacher is always trying to do.
Yeah. So many of your poems bring up issues that are relevant. I mean, this is a podcast for writers. Not everybody listens as a writer, but I like to think about writerly issues, and so many of your poems are relevant to that. With the time we have remaining, I'd love to talk about a few of those your poems that kind of touch on the creative process. And well, actually, let me ask you: are there poems of yours that you find, poems from this collection, that you're especially interested in talking, that raise creative issues of the creative life, the writing life, that you're interested in? I mean, I've got my list, but if you have your list, start with yours.
Yeah, let's see. So, I mean, the first one that I think of from this collection is the poem Ascension. That's one of them. It's the last poem in the book, and I mean, I'm writing about poetry, right? So it's sort of an ars poetica. It is a poem about poetry, and so, no, I think in this poem,
would you be willing just to read it?
Yeah, let me read this.
I'd love that.
Yeah, Ascension. So I wrote this in reflection on Luke 24, verses 44 through 53. This poem has an epigraph from the poet Morgan Parker, her poem Exclamation Point, which says, "We are the revolutionary poem, exclamation point. You don't have to go home, but this is only the start. The good part is what comes next." I love that.
It's so good.
Ascension. And this is what poetry does. It carries us. It invites us into a story, unfinished, saying, "Write the next stanza." It gives us no plan, no blueprint for the future, but simply asks us to witness, take it in and declare what we have seen. It flies away, but does not leave. Its presence remains long after the page has been turned, long after the last word spoken. It leaves us with questions, gazing toward heaven for answers, but no answer descends. Its intent to get us to sit with the questions again.
Wow. No.
Yeah. I mean, so this poem is obviously I wrote it thinking about the ascension, that final act of the Gospel of Luke and the beginning of Acts, right? The ascension. And I can't even tell you what it was that as I was reading that it made me think about. I guess it was just, I was reflecting on the entire sort of journey of the Gospels in a sense, and the journey of Jesus, and just about how poetic it is. And you get to this last sort of scene, and there's this sort of flying away of sorts, this ascension into the clouds, and you have the disciples who are perplexed, which is what poetry often does. Perplexes you, leaves you with more questions than it does answers. But it leaves you with something, right? That Jesus's word is like, "I'm still with you, right? I'll always be with you." Yeah. And I started to think about how, so many of the poems that have been so important for me, right there, they don't have to be super long poems or super, but there's something that leaves its imprint on you and stays with you long after you walk away from it, long after you hear someone recite that thing. But it stays with you and it keeps bringing up new questions in you. And I was like, oh, that is what a poem does. That is what a poem does. And that's what this whole journey is, of faith and all of those things. And so, it really had me thinking about the function of a poem, if you will. Sometimes, I mean, a poem doesn't necessarily need to have a function in the sense of being like having utility.
Right.
But but poems are always doing some sort of work. They're doing something.
Yeah.
And that's one of the questions I'm always asking when I'm writing is like, what work is this poem doing? And that's one of
I'm sorry, you asked that question when you're writing, you said? Or when
when I'm writing, and when I'm reading a poem,
Sure.
but when I'm writing a poem, like what work does this poem want to do? Right. Even that's part of the creative process for me of when I'm writing a poem. And sometimes it's the work of just giving voice to my own grief or welcoming others into grief. Right. There's several poems in this book that are just about me grieving my mother and her passing 10 years ago. And right. And maybe the on one level, the work of that poem was simply to help me name grief. But also that poem goes out into the world. Yeah. And I don't know what it's going to do for somebody else. That's right. How it's going to work on somebody else. That's not your business, is it? That's not my business. That's not my business. Right. But yeah.
Hey, can I ask you a quick question about that, Drew?
Yeah.
At what point in the process do you start asking, what work is this doing?
So I guess it's toward the end. So when I finally get a first draft of a poem on the page. I mean, poems go through, I don't know, so many revisions. But I get that first draft on the page and I look at it and I say, what are you doing? what are you doing? Cause I mean, to me, I think about a poem as having a distinct life from like me. It's separate from me. It's this thing that takes on a life of its own. And I'm the type of writer that I'll get a first line and not necessarily know where it's going. And I love the process of writing that first line and seeing how it's going to unfold on the page. But then it's almost like I have to step back from that and look at it and have a conversation with this thing and seeing, ask that question, what work are you doing? What is this? What's happening here? And then I go back and I jump back in and think about revisions and things like that.
That when you say you have a first line, how often does that line end up being the first line of the finished poem?
For me, it is more often than not. It does end up being the first line. Sometimes it'll end up being somewhere in the middle, and I have to
work up to
it. But I know poets who say they know where they're going. They know how the poem wants to end, and they have to figure out how to get there. Right? I'm not. I don't. That's not typically how I write. Yeah,
and you kind of wade in. Yeah. All right, we're about to run out of time, but there's one more poem that I just really love. There's a bunch that I really love, and unfortunately, we're only going to talk about one, and that is "Beautiful Rejection." Would you read? I mean, I think that's that one is so. I mean, the image that really jumps out to me is the idea of unwanted animal scraps from the enslaver's table, giving rise to soul food. Such a great image. Although that's only one stanza in this poem about the good that rejection does. And also, if you don't mind, help me out. What is this? Is in conversation with Luke 29-19. Which?
Oh yes.
Which passage is that?
That is the passage where Jesus says the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Okay. Yeah.
Excellent.
So would you like me to read it?
Would you? I would love that.
I would love to read it. Yeah. Beautiful rejection. And we have learned there is nothing so beautiful as rejection. Unwanted animal scraps discarded by our enslavers, taken and turned into soul food. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones rejected from those Methodist pews, constructing an ecclesial movement of ebony and mahogany. The story of Michael Jordan being cut from his high school team became legendary to us. The way he built that into 6 rings. There are rejected things inside of me I will one day uncover, only to remold into poetry.
Oh, Andrew, I love that so much.
Thank
and
you. Thank you.
You know, people who do creative work are dealing with rejection all the time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that, in some ways, that feels like it's almost not giving that poem enough credit to frame it in those terms. But still, it was something that I thought about a lot. You know, the rejection that everybody who does creative work has to deal with. And so many beautiful things that came out of rejection in that poem.
I mean, I think so many writers that I know would say it is the rejection, the rejections over and over that really give rise to some of the most beautiful stuff that you produce, right? Because it's part of the process. It's part of the refining and the shaping and the molding, both of the work, but also you as an artist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in that last stanza, you talk about the things inside you that will become rejected things inside of me. I don't know how much you feel like talking about that, but can you say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think there are layers to it. I think at one level, what I'm saying there is, thinking about the things that I have pushed off or rejected or turned away, haven't wanted to look in the face, haven't wanted to embrace, right? As part of my who I am or my own story and my own journey, because maybe they're painful, or maybe I don't know what to do with them. But that somewhere along this journey, I'm gonna have to look those things in the eye. I'm gonna have to embrace them as part of me, and there's something beautiful that's gonna come out of that embrace, right? The thing that I've been rejecting for so long. So I think that is really sort of one of the main things we're trying to say in that last stanza, and just how much of the poetry that I write even comes out of that very process of sitting with the rejected things inside of me, whether that is the things that I've internalized that others have said about me as rejections, about my person, my personhood, or my people, or all of those sorts of things, or those things that I haven't told anybody. But I've never wanted to confront. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. All right, Drew Jackson, last question. Who are the writers that make you want to write? I'm excited about this answer.
There are so many. There are so many. Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Langston Hughes. I'm thinking of some of the poets that are contemporary poets that are writing today, poets like Ada Limon and Jericho Brown, poets like, go back a little bit, Lucille Clifton and Gwendolyn Brooks, Mary Oliver, and I could go on and on. Writers like Imani Perry, Kiese Layman's book, and his book Heavy is like, there's so many writers that have been influential for me. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the list. And thank you for being here, Drew. This has been so fun. I'm a big fan of your work now.
Thank you.
I've only recently been exposed to it, and I'm so excited about the work you're doing. So thank you for the work you're doing, Drew.
Yeah, it's been a joy to be on here with you.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community. funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.